So if you do take for granted that I do want to have a discussion with somebody about their beliefs because I feel like I have enough knowledge, for example, or I'm trying to help someone understand a way of pulling them out of a tragedy or like a rut. But they have done the work, so they've maybe thought for themselves the reason that I believe what I believe is, and so they've grappled with some of these really big questions. But to you, as someone who's maybe inherited tradition through time, we talked about how sometimes this is important to some families as their legacies, that they're passing on tradition um, with each generation. But it's not to say that we know the actual scholarship that's involved in that, right? So tradition sometimes involves practices that aren't based on like a scholarly way of viewing something or understanding something. So this is where nuances and generalizations can be tricky, but it doesn't take away from the fact that sometimes people just want to have um, these ideas and these cultures attributed to them, and they take value in that, and we shouldn't take that away from them. But the assumption that any one person's meaning is always going to be permanently correct, or that shouldn't be revisited or revised, is where we can find ourselves almost undermining our own authority or our own integrity. And we find this when we want to engage with someone who maybe is contemporary and allows themselves to think through the past with different philosophies and different lenses, and who maybe talks with us about, well, maybe some of these practices aren't very applicable to the contemporary context anymore. So sometimes people who have a faith tradition, they rely on the fact that if God has said it, then it must be true. Kind of like what we understand of the first companion of the prophet, where he says, if the prophet said it, then it's true. And that's great. That's an element of faith that God rewards, and it's not to take away from the blessing that exists there, but we shouldn't always assume that our children are like everyone is going to be able to adapt in that way. So there's a tradition by the fourth caliph who was known for his wisdom, and he would say, "Don't raise your children the way you were raised, because they're born for a different context." So what works for you? It's not a very I mean, it's almost logical. It's almost intuitive that since it worked for me and I seem to have turned out fine, why wouldn't it work for the next generation? But we should take a step back and wonder, well, why shouldn't I think like that? Because clearly we know, especially with the technological age right now, advances happen almost overnight, and it's difficult to keep up if you've been maybe taking a bit of a hiatus for like a few weeks or months. So knowing this and then thinking, I want to engage with somebody, but I haven't understood, or I have these really foundational ideas, but I haven't really revised them. And then if somebody says, well, you know what, this doesn't make sense, and in your mind, it's usually, well, if the prophet did it and it's mentioned in the Quran, then it's valid. I just have faith in that. How would you want to engage? This could be somebody who's a neighbor, a coworker. So you can say, okay, you have your way, I have my way, and that's fine. And you can end it there. But what most people want to just shelve that argument, but like my argument is you should continue to think through that, because if you are um, almost that's kind of like an in into what the contemporary context is, and you want to know, that's almost like testing the pulse of like what are people's beliefs and why shouldn't I agree with them? Because now I'm going to have, maybe right now I'm thinking of having kids, or I have nieces or nephews or cousins or whatever age it is, but they're a few years younger than me, or a few generations or decades younger than me. And what if they come to me with these questions and they take for granted that this is something that you value and you take pride in as a part of your history, and you want to promote it forward? Now we have these questions, and faith is important, but you've built the faith maybe because of your life experience allowed you to continue forward with it. But our understanding of faith is going to be different now in a postmodern world, and we need to be able to say that, and with validation, that in spite of this working and the prophet doing it at his time, we don't know the full context of these rulings, for example, or the way certain actions were allowed to be carried out. And why can't we modify something? So if you understand how to go back in tradition and understand, well, what is the methodology that allowed certain ideas to prevail? So sometimes, for example, there are scenarios where the prophet would give like a very, very broad directive. For example, like when you reach this place, do this in a context of prayer, right? Because it's it's almost timed with the variation of where the sun is across the sky. And you usually have a time span, so it's almost like depending on the season around the year, sometimes you have about 2 or 3 hours between each prayer, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. So he had given the directive of saying, when you reach this destination, make sure that you pray. I think it was the third prayer. So the companions, generally, as we know, is each person understood it in a different way. So some, when they arrived right away, they prayed. Some decided, no, we're just going to wait for the prophet because we want to pray together. And he didn't necessarily give um, a judgment, as it were, as to say which one was more correct. It was almost to say, I don't even want to be the person to go into your intention and say which one you had with God that would have been more accurate and would have been more um, accepted as like sincere in a way. So it's almost to say, as long as your effort is there and you're always trying to align with, I mean, what's wrong with my choice right now, other than that I'm trying my best and I'm trying to maybe factor in certain circumstances or events that maybe haven't come across other people's ideas or consciousnesses, because we have a different historical context to begin with. And then there's a language idea and how you make sense of certain words and what your understanding of the person is who's giving the kind of direction. So all these things factor in to almost suggest we can take this on as a way of understanding how to deal with children, how to deal with coworkers, with like in a school setting when we're trying to um, create lenient ways of creating discipline almost. Because what we know is if you create a lot of really fine-tuned rules, it makes children almost hesitant to explore creativity because they feel like there's boundaries where, oh, there must be a right way and a wrong way because look at how tight the limits are. There's like almost no room for error. And I mean, when you think about it now, because we are in such a mechanized world, what in actual lived human experience is actually that need requiring that kind of efficiency? Like almost nothing. It's only if you're building a machine, then you're building a software to understand how to kind of build that. So that's something that is not an actual human action anymore, right? Because it doesn't have heart, it doesn't have consciousness. It's just, it has to maybe, for example, like laser eye surgery, right? It has to almost cut the retina, the cornea in a certain way so that the eye can see better without the actual lens outside or inside your wearing contacts. So in that case, you don't want any error. You want to make it as accurate as possible. Whereas with humans, God is so lenient. Like he says, try your best. You never know how one action could be multiplied from 10 up to 700, like because of your sincerity. So metaphysically, you might think I'm walking down the sidewalk just to get the mail, for example, and I see someone who was maybe, I don't know, trimming their tree, and one of the limbs or branches fell, and it's kind of in the middle of the road. So I could decide I'm just gonna leave it. It's not a big deal. Like it's not gonna get in the way of a car or whatever. But what if there's a little cyclist, like a little kid who's driving his bike or riding his bike, and then he tumbles on it and he hurts himself? So in thinking that, and you might not even have to move it, but because you had that positive thought, you're still rewarded, as though like you're allowing your mind to habitually think of healthy ways to give back to the universe in a way. And then removing it becomes an added dimension to your metaphysical existence. And that is why sincerity, it's God says it's for me. Like I can only be the one to account for it, which means your consciousness is what's paying yourself forward for you, like your good karma in a way. So knowing this, I almost want to emphasize the fact that um, knowing how to understand the ways of building compassion and empathy, and why children want to have these for like it's I know it's sometimes when you see on YouTube like kids who ask for these pets, and then parents want to almost say, do you know how much work is going to be involved in helping take care of this pet, and are you going to do it? Because I know it's probably going to be me. And even though it is a learning process where you have to learn to negotiate, and they're going to have to also learn to negotiate, and you should probably help them understand like what are the responsibilities and what happens when you don't follow through, right? Like maybe the puppy's going to end up being neglected, and what does that look like? Like how would it look like if I um, didn't help you take a bath every day, or didn't let you eat something for several hours, and you got really hungry and then you got grumpy? What is that all like? So thinking like this with children helps them understand emotion and how to relate to another. And because by nature we are loving creatures, sometimes when they have those sad moments and they don't really know how to talk or express emotions, just having someone that's just there, and because animals are so sentient, it's almost like just having that common quiet that people sometimes talk about, where it's a silence that's kind of companionable, and it's not that awkward silence where it's just like you can just be together and almost understand each other without needing to talk. People usually talk about this as like old married couples. It's very hard to come by anymore. Maybe that's not true, but in doing so, you understand the value of building compassion and empathy from a young age. And you see this in families who videotape or record themselves allowing like their children to be gifted with a puppy or something. The utter joy, and sometimes they're brought to tears, and they are happy tears, as though like, and you have no words, like you literally have no words to express the joy, and almost like I have something that's gonna love me and that's gonna love me back. And that to me is God. Like it's a way of expressing that, um, regardless of how parenting cycles are, or kids school environment is, or what their life is, and how they understand and perceive like ups and downs and maybe letdowns, or just like the natural cycle of life, because it's almost good that they have that resilience building in life, and they're not too sheltered or too kind of cushioned about life, that they know, and they start to build ways of rebuilding themselves and regulating their emotions, and then having the resilience to let themselves have these down moments and then pick themselves back up, and how to reach out to those who are around them to kind of help them express love, or um, just commiserate with them. Like you don't even have to say anything, just hang out with me and maybe listen to music or just share with me the space, and then we'll figure out how to move on after that.